We will reflect on the comparison of Japanese evacuation camp in USA with the Legend of Miss Sasagawara short story. First of all, let's figure out the history of Japanese evacuation camp in USA. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, rumors spread, fueled by race prejudice of a plot among Japanese Americans to sabotage the war effort. In early 1942, the Roosevelt administration was pressured to remove persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. On February 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced all Japanese Americans, regardless of loyalty or citizenship, to evacuate the West Coast. This history is actually significant to the short story The Legend of Miss Sasagawara. In the story, the protagonist Miss Sasagawara is known as a ballet dancer with a perfect figure of a woman. She became the topic of gossips among the other evacuees because she seems different than the others. Her life changed totally as she enters the evacuation camp, which actually reflects the suffer gone through by most of the Japanese Americans when they were forced to relocate. These are the components that we will compare between representation of text and context across literature and disciplines, which is literature and history. The literature elements of Miss Sasagawara short story show similarities and differences with the social history of Japanese evacuation camp. Differences in plot. This refers to the story plot of the Legend of Miss Sasagawara, which does not stated in the original Japanese internment camp situation.
The beginning. Sasagawara made the decision to move with his daughter to the Japanese evacuation camp in Arizona after his wife died. Miss Sasagawara was experiencing alienation and prejudice even from her own society. As a woman of a very conservative society, Miss Sasagawara broke the stereotypes, unknowingly becoming a ballet dancer. The foreshadowing. It describes Miss Sasagawara's father, who is very religious and obedient to his God. His daily religious practice somehow foreshadowed as the causes to Miss Sasagawara's mental illness. He neglected his obligation to his one and only daughter. Miss Sasagawara faced all the hardships alone as she has no one to share all her problems after her mother passed away. The rising action. Elsie and Kuku works at the hospital even they have no qualification. Being in the hospital, it allows them to encounter Miss Sasagawara more frequent than they had ever thought. It leads them to know more about Miss Sasagawara's identity, including her mental diseases. The resolution. It turns that probably Miss Sasagawara's reason of mental illness is due to the pressure she had gone through, losing her mother and living with a father who never treated her properly. The life that she has used to before the war and internment camp was totally different, and with the addition of pressure she faced from her parents, the situation getting even worse.
I'll be explaining on similarities in plot, things that are relatable with the reality of Japanese evacuation camp. Take a look at the first aspect. Based on what we have quoted from page 102, it is actually relatable with historical and everyday events. The Buddhist funeral rites is actually a close reference to Buddhism. Bhikshu is usually translated as monk and bhikshuni as nun. Both are actually from Hindi language. Sutras are believed to record important religious practices, sometimes containing the teachings of key religious figures. The people rely upon monks to chant the sutras that will benefit the deceased, and to conduct all funeral rites and memorial services. The second one, based on what we have quoted from page 104, is actually relatable to the history. Based on page 205, part 2, chapter 16, the employment of evacuees in assembly centers, the skill classification is paid at the rate of $12 per month, included the accountants, senior clerks, playground directors, nurses, motion picture machine operators, and cooks. where the block manager, based on Densho Encyclopedia, is the one who's appointed by War Relocation Authority, or the WRA, camp administrators. They carry out bureaucratic tasks in each block and its liaison. They are chosen based on leadership capabilities, the willingness to do the job, and perceived loyalty. They must have bilingual ability. The third one, all of the bolded words are actually equipments and supplies relatable to the history. Based on page 194, part 4, shortly after they were occupied, the equipment was supplemented by the issuance of beds and other items sufficient for hospitalization of from 60 to 100 from 20 patients in each center. Purchased equipment for a total of 1370 hospital beds from funds allotted. Next one is about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It's in the page of 111. It's actually relatable to the history. Mozart was one of the historical figures. He was prolific and an influential composer of the classical era. He had produced more than 100 minuets. Minuets is music written that accompanies a dance. Number 5, based on what we have quoted from page 107, is actually relatable with the history. It's on the report, page 190. The total number of Japanese doctors and nurses in the entire evacuee population was low. It was therefore necessary to allocate such personnel among the centers rather than to allow them to follow the normal course of evacuation. The next one, from page 110, is actually relatable to the history. A 300-year-old comical dance about digging for loaches, but the silly fisher is distracted by things like mud splashing in his face or getting bitten by a leech or his loaches getting away. It's a well-known folk dance all over Japan, but it's strongly associated with the city of Yasugi. The dance is usually performed with the cries of Araisa from Yasugi Bushi, the song of Yasugi, as an accompaniment. Next one is relatable with the history. At that time, the procedure of furthering study has become quite complicated, as the Japanese who wants to further their studies need to wait until they are permitted to relocate.
Of Miss Sasagawara, there are differences and similarities between the characters. For the protagonist character is Miss Sasagawara herself. Before Miss Sasagawara goes to Phoenix for treatment, she is described as a beautiful woman, a 30-year-old ballet dancer, a rude person, an introvert, and a stubborn person. After returning from the sanitarium in Phoenix, she changed her vibes into becoming a friendly person and showed her skill as a good musician and become a dance teacher. However, after the Christmas party, she changed back into her old self as an introvert and a weird person. She was described as a beauty and a different figure from the rest of the occupants. Her differences were emphasized since the start of the story by describing her physical appearances. The next character is the Reverend Sasagawara himself. He is described as a slight and fragile-looking old man. Miss Sasagawara's father is described through visual and tactile imageries. The description played a vital role in ensuring engagement till the end of the story. The calm and composed facade of the man was a camouflage. He is the important character that shaped his own daughter, Mari Sasagawara. Next is the similarities in the characters that is based on the real people during the Japanese internment. First is Dr. Moritomo and Dr. Kawamoto. In the history, the total number of the Japanese doctors and nurses in the entire evacuee population was low. It is explained that the low numbers of doctors and nurses in the evacuee causes the Japanese doctors to graduate earlier than their expected graduation time to fill the demanding numbers of doctors at the hospital and assembly centers. Next is George, the ambulance driver. The ambulance service is described in the Japanese interment in the page 595, number 15.
Moving on, this is the differences in setting, whereby it shows the setting of time or place that's stated in Legend of Miss Sasagawara but doesn't state it specifically in the original document of Japanese evacuation camp. These are the time settings we can find in the short story of Miss Sasagawara. In the original historical document, literary devices of time settings are not stated, which shows it is in a different form than the short story. Moving on to the similarities in setting, it is a portrayal of real-world time and space that describe the setting during Japanese internment camp. The first setting that we can find in the original Japanese evacuation camp situation is the blocks and the camp. It shows that it is similar to the description of real places and spaces. It describes the surrounding of the camp in Arizona. According to Japanese evacuation final report, there were only 245 occupants located there. Internees were packed into 14 barracks that were separated into 4 or 6 rooms. They lived in invariably small spaces that were not designed to hold as many people. The second setting is mess hall and latrines. According to Japanese evacuation final report, standard equipment included fully outfit kitchens and mess halls. Showers, lavatories, and flush toilets were located and spaced to ensure privacy and sanitation. Even where pit-type latrines were erected, flushing devices were installed. Page 184. In page 186, mess halls were again mentioned in the Japanese evacuation final report. It is stated that within each block, shower, lavatories, and toilet facilities were erected. The capacity of each block varied, but the norm was between 6 to 800. Wherever practicable, a kitchen and mess hall were provided for each block. Next setting is hospital. According to Japanese evacuation final report, page 191, hospital buildings were built in a sufficient number of barrack-type buildings to provide ample space for all medical services. Other hospital, complicated obstetrical and major surgical and medical cases were referred and often physically transferred to a local hospital for treatment. Japanese evacuation final report, page 192. This is significant to the situation of Miss Sasagawara, in which she was transferred to other hospital which provide mental diseases treatment.
Next is the symbolism in the legend of Miss Sasagawara. Miss Sasagawara herself was a symbol of othering to other people in the story. The joy of her life is clearly seen with her status as a ballet dancer, something that the society within the camp felt unfamiliar with. This is the reason why the society seems to adapt well with the camp when only Miss Sasagawara shows the pressure of being there. The following incidents, which is when she turns mad, could probably symbolize the rationale of someone who used to be free and suddenly trapped in the internment camp. And next, the decision made by Miss Sasagawara and her father to move might symbolize the feeling of sadness and lonely that they felt after Mrs. Sasagawara died. Therefore, they came to this Japanese evacuation camp in Arizona as their escapism. Differences in imagery. There are few differences in imagery in the story of the legend of Miss Sasagawara. These are 7 examples of Miss Sasagawara's weird behavior. We can see that most of the time, with her head slightly bent, she was staring at a certain place on the floor. For as she continued to look at the same piece of the floor, and this 39-year-old woman wore a beatific expression, and her head was bent to one side, and she actually had one finger in her mouth as she gazed over watching the boys. She jumped up and dashed back into her apartment, banged on the wooden walls with something heavy like a hammer for 5 minutes, and let her long hair all undone and dressed in a nightgown. There are also similarities in imagery which explain real-life situations. These 3 examples are the examples in the legend of Miss Sasagawara about real world in time and space, history, and historical events and everyday events. The first one explains the similarity in real world in time and space. This describes the wake according to folk Buddhism. The second one is the similarities in imagery in history. This description shows how the dull mess hall decorated to celebrate the Christmas party, which also happened during the Japanese internment camp. And the last one is the similarities in imagery about historical or everyday events. This explains the culture of the Japanese people. There are Hiroshima dialect. A boy wore a bow tie and whispered a popular song while the girls shrieked and pretended to be growing faint. My mother sang an old Japanese song.
Okay, as for the reflection, by analyzing both short story and the original report of Japanese evacuation camp, we identify a lot about the painful memories gone through by the Japanese back then. We personally think that the portrayal of Miss Sasagawara is the best to define the suffer. She was once a ballet dancer and had a lovely family, yet as she and her family entered the internment camp, their lives suddenly changed. She lost her mother and her father became a stranger to her. Living in the internment camp itself was so hard, and now Miss Sasagawara has to deal with her family issue. Everyone in the camp probably faced the same problem, yet they can do nothing about it. We also understand the hardships that Miss Sasagawara faced, as our nation too was once faced the same fate when we were being colonized before we reached our memorable Independence Day.